Welcome everybody as you come in. I appreciate y'all taking the time to join us today. You know that it's an interesting summer when the Center for Sport Management Research and Education is offering programming in late July. And so I appreciate y'all participating and logging in, and I think we have faculty and staff and students from A&M, and then also former faculty and former students and community members, and I believe I see Mr. Madlock down here, so people from other states even. So it is good to see everybody, and good to see that it was the advertisement was circulated around in various platforms. So in the interest of time, the panelists were already complaining that I limited them to 10 minutes. And in fact, our history professor said that he was going to get his history card taken away by only talking 10 minutes. And so in the interest of time, we'll go ahead and get going. And so just as some background information, of course, we're all experiencing the pandemic, and it's interesting from a sport perspective, someone who studies sport, someone who participates in sport, how it's impacted all parts of the community. And you may think, here's a picture of the Baltimore Orioles game, and you may think, oh, well, I didn't know they had hosted a home game yet during the pandemic. But no, this was actually mid-season 2016 Orioles stellar audience attendance. So some teams are more used to this than others, I will say. But you know, it's really impacted the way that we think about sport, the way that we participate and engage in sport. And that's really shown yesterday even, and there's new information today that I think some of the panelists will get to. So not only do we have a epidemiologist who's the top selling baseball card ever from this card company, Dr. Fauci, but then we see that Major League Baseball games have been postponed after I think now the team has 17 players who have contracted the virus. And so, and I saw headlines this morning about, oh, well, will this cancel the season? What will it mean for other leagues, for college sports, et cetera? And so these are all the things that we've kind of been thinking about. And I was really interested in hearing others' perspectives on things. And so luckily, Adam and Natasha and JD either all equally had time on their hands or felt pity on me or something to where they agreed to participate in this. But I'm so pleased that they did. And I'll just give a very brief introduction, and then they can add to that as their time goes. And then I'll give a little overview of what we're going to do in the panel, and then let them go at it. So Adam Seip's a professor in the Department of History, and he'll provide a historical overview of sport during times of disruption. So whether that's previous pandemics or other major disruptions that have happened in history, and how sport was delivered or not, or altered during that time. Dr. Natasha Brison is a colleague of mine in health and kinesiology, and she is one of those people that has multiple terminal degrees. So it's not just in abstract. We actually see somebody here who has that. So a JD and a PhD, and she'll talk about the marketing and legal considerations. And then one of our former students who continues to make us quite proud, JD Wood, agreed to participate, and he's with the Dallas Sports Commission and will provide a lot of information. I think his is a context too that continues to evolve on a regular basis. And so that will be good to hear what all he has to say. So we will have about 10 minutes again for each of these presentations, and then hopefully have 20 to 30 minutes for question and answer. I'm glad to see that my practice from 1,378 Zoom calls has finally paid off, and that I was able to figure out how to mute somebody when they came in. So I think all of y'all are muted, and that will be helpful as we go along if you want to stay muted until you have a question. And later on, when we have the question and answer in some of our larger seminars we've offered this summer, it's been helpful to use the raise hand feature, and then we'll just go down by, as soon as people raise their hand after everybody's talked, we'll just go sequentially from there. So with that, I'm going to hand it off to Dr. Seipp, and I'll mute myself and take some notes. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, George, and thanks also to JD and Natasha, and thanks to all of you for coming out on a gloomy afternoon, at least in College Station. So responding to George's frankly intolerable demand that this be 10 minutes, I've decided that I really want to focus my remarks on a particular moment in the history of sports and in the history of the world, the so-called Spanish flu pandemic in 1918 and 1919, which I think provides some fairly direct analogs to our moment today and might give us some things to think about. There are really three arguments that I want to make in my remarks. The first, and probably the broadest, is that sports provides something in our lives far beyond the game. It provides, in times of crisis, a crucial marker for what normalcy might look like. It provides a marker for a way of providing social interaction and a reminder of what life looked like before and what life might look like after. It is therefore important that we study sport not only as itself, but as part of a much wider system of interaction. Second, sports, broadly speaking, has been here before. And I think the 1918-1919 pandemic can really shed some light on where we are and where we might be going. And then third, despite the world of challenges that we're in right now as a global society, as a community, as people who are interested in sports in various capacities, despite the very real challenges, there are also opportunities here. And history points us to the conclusion that there might indeed be places where sports can grow if they are managed well, and if we as practitioners and scholars think carefully about the steps that we take. So again, the context that I'm focusing on is the so-called Spanish flu outbreak. I say so-called because the one thing we know for sure is that it wasn't Spanish. It was called that in a sort of, in the haste of the moment. Oddly, it probably actually originated in the United States. There are epidemiologists who disagree on this, but I think there's some degree of consensus that it emerged from the United States sometime in early 1918 and spread around the world with terrifying, terrifying speed. Between 1918 and early 1920, something like 50 million people around the world died of this strain of influenza. 675,000 Americans died. 20,000 Texans were among the dead. If you extrapolate that out to Texas's current population, that's about 120,000 people. So we're talking about a very substantial death rate, and a death rate that occurred, like I said, with absolutely terrifying speed. Before I talk at all about sports during this period, I want to stress that there were also some pretty significant differences between the world that was ravaged by the influenza outbreak and the world of today, and particularly some of them epidemiological and some of them sort of historical and social. First, the world of 1918 was a world that was still engulfed by the First World War. And in a way, this actually helps us to draw parallels with today, because it's easy to think about our modern globalized world with ease of transportation and people moving around in fairly uncontrolled ways and thinking this is something profoundly modern. But in fact, if you look back 100 years ago, there were millions of people on the move, not just because of global trade and commerce, but because of a global war. So there were people moving back and forth between continents who provided an ideal delivery vector for this virus. And then second, the 1918-19 pandemic had a very peculiar demographic component when it came to mortality. That is to say, the Spanish flu killed younger people at a really quite astonishing rate. It disproportionately killed those between the ages of 20 and 40, and particularly those between the ages of 25 and 30. And there are biological reasons for this, but this has a very direct bearing on the conversation about sports because it killed athletes. It killed lots and lots of athletes. And you see here one of the slides here. This is a page from the leading football soccer newspaper in Switzerland. These are obituaries for young soccer players taken in the prime of their lives, in the prime of their playing careers by this virus. So it was a virus that particularly affected the kinds of athletes that we are considering today. So in my remarks, I want to talk first a little bit about the United States, what happened in the United States, then to talk a little bit more globally. It is no exaggeration to say that sports in the United States were profoundly impacted by the double impact of both the war and the Spanish flu. The Major League Baseball season in 1918 and then in 1919 was dramatically interrupted by both of these traumas. Baseball players were not considered to be what we would call essential workers. They were draft eligible. Major League Baseball rosters shrunk pretty considerably. And the Major League season was shortened. A number of prominent Major League players were negatively affected by the Spanish flu. Probably the most prominent in hindsight was a Boston pitcher, one of the heroes of the 1918 World Series, George Herman Ruth, who spent 2 weeks on the disabled list when he came down with the Spanish flu. Interestingly enough, because of the smaller roster and because several other players got sick, Ruth began to play positions other than pitcher. He'd play first base and he'd play in the outfield, which would be where we know him best. Probably the sport most dramatically interrupted by the Spanish flu was professional hockey. The National Hockey League made it all the way to the Stanley Cup Finals in 1919 before the series had to be abandoned with the series tied up between Montreal and Seattle 2-2 when so many players on both teams got sick that they were unable to continue. College football, this is something that people who know Texas A&M might know well, did manage to continue, though with a reduced schedule, and Texas A&M claims to be co-national champion of the 1919 flu-shortened season. But it's a little bit difficult in this to tell, honestly, which of these effects came from the war and wartime restrictions on social interaction and which came from the flu. But we can see pretty clearly in photos like the one that you see here that there were mask mandates, and there were those who were bitterly opposed to mask mandates. There were some cities and some states that opened too quickly. There were some that stayed fairly restricted, and there were many that fell in between. People who study the history of the Spanish flu point to the state of Pennsylvania, which had possibly the most disastrous response in the United States, allowing public events, including parades and sporting events, to go on long after it was clear to anyone how profoundly unsafe that was. So we can definitely see the impact of the Spanish flu in the United States, though again, we have to balance that a little bit with the war. Certainly, if you turn the lens to Europe, even if you look at a country that wasn't involved in the war like Switzerland, Switzerland was hit with the double impact of the Spanish flu and being surrounded by wartime states. The Swiss soccer season had to be cut short in 1918 because so many teams were having to forfeit matches because their playing fields had been turned into small farms to grow food, notably potatoes, for a population that was unable to get some of the resources they were used to getting on the international market. This was a strange war, a strange disease outbreak, and these were profoundly frightening times, even for countries that weren't directly affected by the war. International sports, still something fairly in their infancy in the second decade of the 20th century. In 1919, there was an international competition, a really remarkable one, and anyone out there who's looking for a dissertation to write in sports history might think about this, because it really hasn't been looked at very much. The inter-allied games that were played by bored soldiers waiting to go home in the camps in France at the end of the war. It's really sort of a fascinating moment. There were Olympics in 1920 in Antwerp, in Belgium, which was not only badly affected by the flu, it was also a place where World War I had been particularly ferocious, and there were widespread fears the city simply wouldn't be able to host the Olympics. The British were almost unable to participate in the Olympics because the government had no interest in funding a team, and public subscriptions to send the team to Antwerp fell on deaf ears. It didn't help that the longtime director of the British Olympic Association, Lord Dunham, died of the flu in the middle of the fundraising campaign. We have a letter written by the British, one critic in the British Foreign Office who was opposed to sending a British Olympic team, who wrote that given the effects of the Spanish flu, quote, "it seems to be somewhat anomalous to raise large sums of money to decide who can run the fastest or jump the farthest." One of the places where we see the effects of the Spanish flu play out most dramatically in the world of sports was in South America, which had just recently, as in 1916, organized the first Continental Soccer Association, an organization that still exists, CONMEBOL, which was centered in Brazil. And what we see in Brazil, and this is actually going to bring me into the last part of my remarks, is actually, I think, really fascinating. A group of Brazilian business elites centered in Rio were insistent that despite the flu, that the new South American football championships should be held as scheduled in 1919 in Brazil. And in fact, led by the owners of Fluminense, still one of the most important soccer clubs in Brazil, those championships were held. And there were, I think, a couple of really interesting sort of outgrowths of this. One is that it was the moment, the sort of clear moment, where soccer went from being a sport played largely in Rio, where there was lots of British influence, to a sport that really became the dominant sport in one of what is now one of the most soccer-mad countries on earth, in Brazil. Also, not coincidentally, the outbreak of Spanish flu in many of the cities of Brazil outside of Rio was actually brought by visiting soccer teams. So there were definitely some negative consequences to this as well. But this brings me really to the point where I want to conclude these remarks, which is that, as we can see in Brazil, this was not only a time of economic and social dislocation, and a time when sports could not be played, at least in the way that many people wanted them to be played. It was also an opportunity to build new institutions and to build on existing relationships. And I want to close with something that happened in the United States as a direct result of the Spanish flu. In the wake of the devastation of the flu, in the wake of the devastation of nearly 700,000 dead, educational reformers began to look hard at what they saw as a lack of physical activity, a lack of physical health on the part of young Americans who had died in such large numbers. And it is, in fact, not accidental that it was in the 1920s that people like some of the folks I'm talking with today and some of the folks who are listening today, educational reformers who thought about sports in higher education, began to press for more sustained physical activity in the United States. In 1920, a report from the Society of Directors of Physical Education in Colleges recommended, largely as a result of the flu, that, quote, group activities, particularly games and athletic sports under favorable conditions, be promoted in American colleges and universities. Essentially the birth of physical education as we know it today. Within 10 years of 1919, 23 states would mandate the teaching of physical education in schools. This was particularly important for women's sports, which experienced dramatic growth in the 1920s, obviously with certain limitations and restrictions. So this is all to say that while these are scary moments, and these are moments that seem to be upending many of the certainties that we thought we knew, that this is also a moment of tremendous potential generative growth, and that gatherings like the one that we're having today can be the beginning of conversations that can help us to expand on what we think about the role of sports in American society, and indeed in the world, can be. Thank you very much.
Bravo. I was taking notes. a moment of tremendous generative growth. Love it. All right. Thank you, Dr. Seipp. Let's now move on to Dr. Brison, who will talk about some of the legal and marketing implications.
All right, so can everybody hear me? I need to make sure my mic is on. Is that thumbs up? Yeah, perfect. So I wanted just to give you some context about what I'm about to discuss. Brands spent a little over $1.1 billion on March Madness advertising in 2019 for approximately 22.5 billion impressions. It was predicted that the NCAA tournament in 2020 was going to have about $60,000 to $75,000 for early round ad spots, with final ad game spots costing about $950,000. And this is only one example of the potential revenue that these games were going to be able to have, at least from the initial part of 2020. And then, of course, we all know the pandemic hit. And so I want you to also think about what the NBA, Major League Baseball, and even European soccer face regarding player contracts, sponsorship agreements, and overall lost revenue from ticket sales. So ultimately, we saw the pandemic resulted in enormous marketing and legal implications for both sport and what I call sport adjacent brands. So I'm going to talk about some of the legal issues and then move into the marketing issues. But before I get into the legal issues, I have to include a disclaimer. This information is not meant to provide legal advice, only to highlight some legal issues sport entities may encounter. So those of you who have a legal background know that is necessary. So there are two primary areas I'll focus on with regards to legal implications: contract obligations and risk management considerations. With regard to the contract obligations, a pandemic can prevent performance by the parties to actually follow through with their obligations under the contract. This could be a team's agreement with its players, as I mentioned, sponsorship agreements, or even a player's endorsement agreement. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the player contract perspective. And I'm also talking about some European soccer cases as well. So player wages represent 50% of the Bundesliga revenues and almost 60% of the English Premier League. So when the quarantine was first put into place, the UK Health Secretary asked for players to play their part, and this included pay cuts and wage deferrals of 20% or more. Some of the clubs even implemented furloughs. However, players in the Swiss club, FC Sion, they terminated the contracts of 9 players who refused to accept reduced terms. We also saw a few weeks ago, Under Armour announced that it wanted to terminate its agreement with UCLA due to loss of revenues from the pandemic. And I could probably talk about that for another hour with just that case alone. But with any contract dispute, the first step is to examine the actual contract. Most are going to contain clauses for a breach by either party, termination, and what's most relevant during these times is a clause called force majeure. So this particular clause excuses a party from their contractual obligation in light of an unexpected event beyond its control in specified circumstances. And so those specified circumstances are really important because typically you're going to find that there's going to be a list of events that are going to excuse performance. And usually we'll see terms such as a flood, earthquake, labor or work stoppages, national emergencies, declarations of war, acts of God, acts of any regulatory or government body or agency, or laws that actually prohibit performance. And these are just a few. And what you're going to see is that these types of clauses are both contract specific and jurisdiction specific. But even as you're thinking about the force majeure clause as a way to get out of a contract, it doesn't always excuse performance simply because they can't fulfill the obligations or that fulfillment is difficult. So when you're thinking about contract disputes, other clauses need to be considered when you're drafting them. And for the sake of time, I won't go into what some of those other clauses would be. Regardless, what I'd like to recommend is that parties should consider acting in good faith to resolve the disputes. We're dealing in some really tumultuous times and people can get really hot and heated, but thinking about the best interests of the parties, trying to preserve the relationship, and this could include renegotiating the agreement with replaceable or acceptable benefits, or even delaying the performance under the current contract, but really trying to work with the parties to make sure that this is a situation where everyone comes together and tries to figure out what's the best alternative here. We know that our event has passed, but how do we move forward and how do we fulfill the obligations of both parties? And so that's just a real quick on just contract obligations. So under the risk management considerations, here's where it gets a little interesting. So companies are focusing on assumption of risk and waiver of liability agreements with sport participants. And so a liability waiver is essentially a written contract between two or more parties, and one party acknowledges the risks of participating in an activity or service. And by acknowledging that risk, the party also waives the right to sue for injuries or damages arising out of the activity or services. And so when we look at liability waivers, it could be a simple clause in a services contract or a separate agreement of its own. Here's where I talked about it gets a little interesting. So I've seen examples of a COVID waiver being used. The first one I found, Disney implemented a waiver for its Walt Disney World Resort, stating that by visiting the resort, guests assume all risks related to exposure to COVID-19. There was a Boys and Girls Club in San Francisco that required the waiver to be signed prior to participating in activities at the facility. And then recently I saw that SMU, the Ohio State, and Indiana University required their student athletes to sign waivers in order to participate in sport. So currently it's unclear whether a COVID liability waiver would be enforceable. And this is primarily due to there are no prior cases involving a waiver in the pandemic. But overall, courts would state that even with the waiver in place, facilities bear a reasonable duty of care and should do what they can to mitigate the risks. So there's still this concept of making sure that facilities are safe and you are considering those who are entering. Ultimately, on the legal side, companies should try to avoid litigation. And as I mentioned earlier with contract disputes, just try to be fair and try to figure out what's going to be best for all the parties. Okay, so now I'm going to switch to marketing just a little bit. So with the pandemic still a concern, several teams are examining revenue models as well as marketing and sponsorship alternatives if no fans are allowed in their facilities. So it's interesting because the Buffalo Bills have a lot of other things going on right now, particularly with their contract with their naming rights agreement with New Era. New Era is trying to get out of that agreement. And even though some of the terms are related to the pandemic, New Era actually started several years ago to try to get out of that agreement because of their financial difficulties. So the Bills have looked at having 15% capacity, 33% capacity, and even a 50% capacity. Some of the teams in the league have even offered to let their season ticket holders opt out of their 2020 tickets with no penalty. But when I'm thinking about marketing and really to kind of capture what I'm starting to see with some of the advertisements, for marketers, there are mainly 3 points: to empathize with consumers regarding what's going on, be creative, and then most importantly, to adapt. And so just to give you a couple of examples of things that are happening with regards to that adaptation, there was a new initiative approved by NFL owners last month, and they're allowing the first 8 rows to be covered with advertising banners that would be visible on television broadcasts. The International Olympic Committee, as we all know, had to postpone the Olympics a year. They're running a Twitter campaign featuring historical Olympic filling lightings. And so they said the campaign was designed to remind people that their overall mission is to make life a little better through the promotion of sport. And at this time of challenge, we'll be stronger together, which I think is a great message that resonates with all of us. I think my favorite is the NBA. They've actually partnered with Microsoft using the Teams Together mode, and they're placing more than 300 fans of each team courtside in a virtual experience during live games. So there are 17-foot LED screens around the arenas, and fans can react in real time, and players are able to see their reactions. Major League Baseball kind of got in on this as well. So they replaced their empty seats with CGI fans, and they also have fake crowd noises for its broadcast. And there are also virtual tarps for advertisers to be able to put their logos on. And so the images that you actually see on the screen, you see that Nike actually had their Play Inside campaign. And it said, if you ever dreamed of playing for millions around the world, now is your chance. Play inside, play for the world, which I thought was a very good indication of what everyone was experiencing and how best to do your part in what was going on. The second one is the sport fan cutouts. So teams such as the Oakland A's, the Atlanta Braves, the San Francisco Giants, Milwaukee Brewers, just to name a few of them, they're allowing fans to purchase cardboard cutouts of themselves be placed in the stadiums. And the prices range from about $50 with the Atlanta Braves to up to $299 for some of the Dodger cutouts. And fans are notified on the seat section, but not a specific location. So essentially when there's the broadcast, they have to look around and see if they can find themselves in the crowd kind of thing in that section. The last one is this Bud Light advertisement. And so unfortunately, we can't show you the video because we ran into some difficulties, but in this advertisement, if you can get a chance to look at it through YouTube, it's only 50 seconds, but there's a Bud Light vendor walking through neighborhoods, promoting budlight.com and the ability for Bud Light to be delivered to households. And so these are some of the really creative things that I've seen people do marketing wise. And so as we think about those campaigns, ultimately brands need to balance responding to the current health crisis and carrying on with their business and regular marketing activities, making sure that they're still empathizing, but being able to entertain fans and cater to their consumer markets. And then ultimately with regards to any marketing campaigns, brands have to be authentic and they also need to stay true to their brand's purpose. And I'll turn it over to JD.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Dr. Brison. And now we'll go to JD Wood, and I'll move the slide. There we go.
Perfect. Well, I appreciate everybody joining us today and the opportunity to speak. I was joking with George ahead of time that I feel like I'm going to be the doom and gloom and might be a little too real for everyone a little bit. But I wanted to kind of use the opportunity to kind of give you, compare and contrast the difference between the day in the life, what it was before COVID, and then kind of what it was, you know, since COVID has happened. And for anybody on the call that has known me, they know that I've been fortunate enough, due to the connections and the degree at Texas A&M, that I've been able to work in the sports industry my entire career. And I had the opportunity to, last 2 years, I was at Panama City Beach, Florida, and in February, so a month and a half before COVID really started to affect everyone to the nth degree, I moved back to Texas. And so, you know, going from 10 years of 50 weeks, 50 weekends a year, 50, you know, 100 plus events, busy all the time, going and going and going, you know, on a yearly basis. And then coming to Dallas, I mean, just to give you an example, I was only in the office for 40 days. And when I was here, I put in bids for Major League Baseball All-Star Game, CONCACAF Gold Cup, as well as some international FIFA qualifying matches. And that was all within 40 days of first being here. So we were rocking and rolling. And March 17th, it came to a dead stop. We've been working remotely since then. And to kind of put an example, I said, like I said earlier, I was working 50 weeks a year, and I haven't had an event in 20 weeks. And put it in context, it really changed everything. The Dallas Sports Commission, so far to date have lost 34 events, which is roughly $216 million in economic impact that we've lost so far. We have the estimate if it goes until the end of 2020, which is unfortunately looking like it's going that direction, we'll lose an additional 20 events and another $134 million of economic impact. And where we're staying positive and continuing to push forward, it's definitely affected the industry. I mean, we went from 97 employees to 52. It definitely has been trying, but at the same time, my dad always said, if you love what you do, you don't work a day of your life. So the opportunity that in the community in sports, like, yes, there's a lot of individuals that unfortunately are being laid off, pay cuts, furloughed, but we're still communicating on a daily basis because the passion is there to be in this industry. So that should show the individuals on this webinar that are interested still moving forward. You should still keep pushing and still be a part of this because it's a family and we all work together and we still communicate on a daily basis. To kind of put it into context a little bit on like kind of the landscape and sports industry as a whole. We always joked that it was recession proof, especially when it comes to, the experiences, whether it's from youth tourism-based sports or from the experience of going to a game professionally, going to a collegiate game. People were willing to put off paying other things to have that experience that escape from the everyday 8 to 5 monotony. So yes, our numbers dipped in 09, like most of everyone else, but not to the drastic level. And then the leading out the gate for everyone was the sports industry. So we used to joke about it being recession proof. And to kind of put into context how much it's not recession proof, we're doing some stuff with the Aspen Institute, and 64% of the sports industry has had a pay cut or been furloughed or been officially let go. Like 64%. And we're talking people that are head of sports commissions in smaller destinations. We're talking people that are Parks and Rec. We're talking people that are, I've been seeing all the posts on LinkedIn, all the staff of the Rough Riders. Like everybody is taking these cuts. And so it's definitely, those are the negative sides, right? And you're looking at staffing. There's less jobs, and you have experienced people that are going to be going after those positions, not only right out of college, but people that have been 5-10 years in the industry. And so it's kind of like, cannibalism. You're having from your organizations to your staffing. So it's giving a whole lot of pause. Where there are some, I guess, positives that you're going to see out of it. And a lot of times, and we always talked about this when I had the opportunity to be an adjunct for the program, is everyone focuses on the NHL, the MLB, NFL, everything like that. But your youth tourism and your smaller scaled events versus your larger scaled events are already bouncing back. I mean, I joke that I'm living vicariously through my friends in Panama City Beach and in College Station because they're hosting events. So you can make things work on a 160-acre soccer complex. I can't do that at Cowboy Stadium. You can't split that up because the revenue is not there. You're seeing a lot of the approaches different. I mean, I know we talked about Major League Baseball. Everyone's seen the Marlins in the news and what they're doing. I honestly think the NHL and even the NBA have it. They're doing it right. The NHL, we worked at least 2 months on trying to become a hub city. Unfortunately, there was the spike in Texas, so we lost out on hosting it. But NHL essentially has 12 teams at one hotel, one rink, and one practice venue. And they're able to control access to everything. That's who is doing it the proper way. And the NBA is right there as well. I think Major League Baseball, we're going to see more struggles, unfortunately. And I think NFL, and unfortunately, I already got my home game tickets, and I'm going to be disappointed if something happens. But I'm hoping I'm wrong. I'm nervous. I'm just going to be honest. But the opportunity to host small-scaled events versus large-scale is drastic. I mean, like I said, they're hosting 184-team soccer tournaments here in Labor Day, but I can't get any other kind of event to pretty much make because it needs to be outside. Some of the things, and I know it sounds like I'm being kind of a Debbie Downer about everything, but I want it to be realistic. And if you've heard me speak before, I always say this all the time: is how bad do you want it when it comes to work in the sports industry? Most of the time, people, we call it the 5-year rule. I see Marcus bounce his head up and down. Is 5 years. Most people aren't willing to put in the work, and in the time of not making the money, well, that's going to be even more now. But when you get to that and we get through this together as a sports family, you're going to have a lot of opportunity to expand and grow. And so and that's where I go into it. Really, the next steps are so exciting because, we're not booking any events for now through 20, and there's very few events going on, very few sports. 21 and further, we are packed. Anything where I canceled USA Mexico last year with CONCACAF, well, they're having conversations on top of the Mex Tour at the same time. So we're going to have, we could have, 3 or 4 FIFA level matches within 2 months here in Dallas coming up in May, June, and July. So it's very exciting on what the possibilities are. And you're going to see new avenues where, yes, we're losing jobs in kind of like the core areas that a lot of people have looked. But it'll go back to looking at getting your experience over all facets. It's kind of like, even though I know minor league baseball is struggling right now, that'll be the route that you want to go. You want to get the experience. You want to push through. You want to work with, collegiate staffs. You want to get those ideas to put on multiple hats because that's what's going to make you an easier hire for people later. And so that's going to be even more. I think from a sports commission standpoint, and you're going to see a lot of diversification, not only in funding sources. Right now we're completely funded by hotel tax dollars. So usually we have an 82% capacity right now in Dallas. We're at 20%. So we have no revenue coming in to support ourselves right now. So you're going to see, and the positive is one of the reasons I was brought in was to diversify, creating our own events, looking at sponsorship funding mechanisms, looking at other ways to bring in the dollars. And so you're going to see groups changing the focus not only from tourism but to community, to be involved, and you're going to see that community outreach program and that person become even more important. You're going to see a lot of businesses that are going to be started through subcontracting. You're going to see people like, hey, I have to lose my, a lot of my core staff, but unfortunately, a lot of the time, marketing and PR is the first people to go. But then you're going to have the opportunity for like a PR firm or a marketing firm that's going to be hired and outsourced. So you're going to see those entities given those opportunities. And that is something, the marketing one, the one I've been actually working on with a friend to kind of give some advice on is they're going to create basically a location to find all the facilities around the United States, and they're going to market those facilities based off of like a subscription model. So you're essentially going to come in, instead of Dallas pushing out for all of 120 venues, a venue can go directly to them and they can connect them to U.S. Soccer directly. And you're going to see a lot of those kind of things kind of begin the opportunity for people, if they don't have staff for it, to hire others to do so. You're going to see a lot of safety procedures, GBAC certifications. We're going to market and sell how safe and clean a city we are in the facilities. And so you're going to see some new instances that's going to change and really kind of give another avenue of career paths for people that maybe they've never thought about before. And I want to, the last thing I'll say is looking at what some advice and some things for the students that are on the call to look forward to. I can guarantee you one of my very first questions will be when I'm doing interview processes, what did you do to maximize your time during COVID-19? What did you do to make yourself better? How did you differentiate yourself? I mean, I've gotten 2 certifications during this time frame. And so if I can figure out a way to do it in time with 2 kids under 4, I know everyone else should be able to. So that'll be one of my first questions that I'm asking. And so I definitely, where right now it's a little doom and gloom, I could tell you from someone that's only ever worked in this industry, and that I see the future as being bright and exciting for people that can have the imagination and the willingness to put in the time and energy to grow.
Wonderful. Thank you. I was jotting down the notes. I think that's a great perspective of what did you do to make yourself better during this time. Very good approach. All right. So thank you all for the great comments. I was pleased that we didn't go 45 minutes for each one. Generally 10 minutes. Hats off. We now have time for some questions and answers, and I think there are a couple comments on the chat as well. Let's see how I would do that. But if you want to raise your hand, use the raise your hand feature down by the participant section, or anything like that, then we can just go sequentially through. All right. Let's see, Marcus, I see, is that a thumbs up or a raise hand? Either way. All right. Oop. There we go. You ready?
Yeah, is it Dr. Seipp, the historian? All
yes.
right.
Yep.
All right. So I got a question for you. You are at the head of the table. At your table, you have Rob Manfred, Gary Bettman, Adam Silver, Roger Goodell, Kathy Engelbert, and Mark Emmert, president of NCAA. What would you share with them right now based off of your research with the Spanish flu and its effect on sport? Those are all the heads of our professional sports leagues and NCAA.
Sure.
What would you share with them right now as they have to govern these leagues and what your research has shown you. Because I found the Spanish flu, I just read about it a couple months ago when all this came up. And so to hear you speak about it, you got the floor with those guys. What would you say?
I would say they have a responsibility to the society in which they operate to be as conservative as they possibly can be about making sports, exposing people to this. And I say that, you know, and the real important caveat, that's the top line. The real important caveat here is what I said earlier about the profile of the Spanish flu. The Spanish flu killed young people. And there are reasons for it that I only dimly understand, because if I'd done better in biology, I might be doing something different with my life. But, you know, it is clear that that was a different calculus. But what we see in 1919 and what we see today is that when there's a rush to get groups of people back out in close proximity with each other, people get sick and people die. And if we accept that sports is a critical part of our society, how we imagine ourselves, how we interact with each other, then it's their responsibility as executives in sports to keep public health at the center of their vision, as difficult as that can be. So that's a great question. Thanks a lot for asking. And boy, I think I haven't checked my messages recently, but I don't think any of those people are dying to find out what a Spanish flu historian thinks at the moment. But thanks a lot for letting me imagine.
We may have a follow-up on that. There's a interested participant, Leslie Seipp, who had a question as well. And then I'd be curious to see what the other panelists would say to the commissioners. So
do we know each other?
Leslie, what do you have there?
Hi, Mr. Wood. How would you say the pandemic will affect international sports and like the World Cup and CONCACAF and FIFA? How would you say how would you say this pandemic will affect as someone in the sports management profession?
Yeah, I think honestly that the changes that we're seeing from the health procedures, from the mask to the social distancing to how that they're approaching the protocols, is something that we're going to have moving forward. I think how that plays into play even more besides health is looking at the cost of every event just went up exponentially. So how are they going to figure out ways to figure out make more money from ticket sales, from sponsorships, from any avenue they can to diversify the money coming in to offset those costs that they're going to have to be responsible for with this pandemic? Because I think you saw in the news, they've already found something similar, another SARS virus in China already that, it has the ability, but so far hasn't done anything. So these are going to be things and changes that we're going to live with moving forward. So when we're looking at the World Cup in 2026, from the mass transit with the trains, from the dart rails to, everything flying, all the planes flying in, we're going to have to take into care all of these stop processes to make sure that everyone is safe and healthy moving forward.
Excellent. Thank you much. And if we could return to that previous question as well, and I thank you for the question, Rowan. If Dr. Brison or JD, if y'all had the commissioner's ears, what would you ask them? And then we'll move to Dr. Pittman after that.
I'll go ahead. Just to reiterate what I originally said, that whether you're a commissioner, you're looking at facilities, from a legal perspective, that reasonable duty of care and the duty to mitigate the risks for fans, for players, I think that's the most important thing to consider. And I mean, definitely fans are missing sport. We're all in that same boat where we're hurting to be able to go into a venue, but the first priority should be the safety of the players and fans. And I think the creative measures that the teams are taking and the leagues are taking are phenomenal, but that first and foremost should be alleviate some of the risks that everyone could potentially be exposed to.
I would agree as well. I think that I don't want to keep saying the same thing over, but the best way I could read, with two children, young children, and yes, I know they're not as likely to have issues. Those key things keep going through my head. And I think of, I heard a quote, and it's really grim, and I know I'm going to butcher it, but essentially it was at a school board meeting, a veteran basically said, I'm haunted by, the lives I took. How would you feel about the lives you would take by opening too soon? And that just, it hit home, thinking about the age of my kids and everything. And so that's how I would want them to really think about it in that perspective. If something happened, not only to kids, but just think about from financially, what if something happened to high-end athletes, that they put a lot of dollars into, how adversely that affects their brand and the image of that league because they wanted the quick fix versus a long-term solution.
Excellent. Thank you both. Let's go with Dr. Pittman, and then we have a question in the chat after that. So after you, Dr. Pittman. We can't hear you. Let's see here. All right, can you unmute yours, Andy? All right, so we can't hear you, but how about you type it in the chat or unmute? There we go.
Can you hear me now?
Perfect. Yes, perfect.
I appreciate all of you putting your work together, because this was something that I put a presentation together about an hour Zoom conference with my sport law class, and I had a lot of help with Ashland Hardy. We started working on this back in March, and I've got a big collection of articles up here, and I'd like to share them with you if you're interested. I went to the post office today, just about an hour before here. Guess what? National Geographic cover, Stopping Pandemics. They have about 30 or 40 pages of stuff in there going all the way back to the bubonic plague and things like this. So I thought it was kind of ironic that they came out with this today. And then one of the questions that Ashland and I had in my presentation, are we ever going to get rid of it? Probably not. Bubonic plague is still around. Matter of fact, there was a squirrel that tested positive for the bubonic plague in Colorado about 2 weeks ago. And there was a teenage boy in Mongolia who died from the bubonic plague because he ate one of the marmots, which is a part of the family of squirrels. So I think this is something, as y'all correctly pointed out, it's with us. It's going to be here, and we're going to have to learn to deal with it. And we, all the doctors have said probably October, November, it may come back worse than it ever been before. So we got to be prepared for it. So again, I appreciate all the work that you guys have done. And if any of you are interested, I could share some of the things that I found with you if you give me your email addresses after this is over. And Dr. Brison, we miss you, and Dr. Cunningham, miss you. And JD, miss you too, the former students. So, but be glad when things get back to the quote unquote, the new normal, whatever that is. So, but thanks, I appreciate it. And George for putting this together.
Sure, thank you for those comments. Let's go to the, let's see, we have 6 minutes, that's plenty of time. So a chat or a question from Dr. Bloomfield, who's joining us from Colorado. So the question is for Dr. Seipp. Any lessons from the Spanish flu era for the proposed scheduling of the 2020 Summer Olympics in 2021?
So the Antwerp Games are in 1920 are kind of, I suppose you can say that the Olympic organizers got lucky. By the time the games came around, the worst of the flu had passed. And obviously the Olympics were a much smaller endeavor at that point. They probably should have been delayed. And in fact, when I was thinking about writing a book about the 1920 Olympics, which I ended up not working on, I found a terrific campaign by the city of Cleveland, Ohio, to try to take the games away from Antwerp. I don't know if we have any Cleveland residents here, but if it's a choice between going to Cleveland or going to Antwerp, even with bomb damage, I'll take Antwerp. But anyway, I think that given my, it's consistent with my previous response. I think conservative conservative is good here. As we've all noted, these are tremendous, these decisions have tremendous public health consequences. And I mean, something like the Olympics, which brings together people from all over the world, this would just be an epidemiological cul-de-sac that would be there. I can patent that. The results of which I would rather not even think about. So I think if there's a short answer to this, it's that there was no other decision to be made than to postpone.
All right. Any other questions or comments? Question for Dr. Brison. So what are the role of waivers for high school or college athletes? And what responsibilities are schools and colleges willing to take if one of the athletes dies from COVID-19? Good question.
Well, if the waiver is, okay, so first let's backtrack and just talk about what the waiver is supposed to do. So, and I don't know who asked this question, but we've all participated in a rec league or went to the recreation center, and we had to sign a waiver that, like, for example, I did rock climbing last year, and I had to sign a waiver saying that if I fell or got hurt, that I would not sue the recreation center. And that's essentially what the waiver does. It protects the facility or the organization from a lawsuit. Now, what's interesting about these waivers, the fact that this is something new that we really haven't seen, the enforceability of them is going to be tricky. And so essentially when you sign the waiver, the main purpose is that you're aware of the risks and you understand that even in light of these risks, you're still willing to move forward with the activity. So with the student athletes and what I've seen with those waivers, they're just acknowledging that there are risks and that they still want to participate. It has no bearing on their scholarships or their eligibility. And so worst case scenario, and I was discussing this with a colleague, I thought about the baseball rule where on the back of tickets, fans assume the risk that if they go into a facility and they're hit by a foul ball, that they can't sue the league, the team, the facility, and so on. And so that's essentially what probably the best kind of similar situation of what we could see. So yeah, I mean, I asked the same question. It's like, well, what if someone dies from COVID? Can the family still sue? Of course, the first thing that someone will say is, oh, well, they signed this waiver, so they're not going to sue. But we've still seen people sue with regards to accidents in baseball facilities. So, but it really is going to depend on the jurisdiction. It's going to depend on the wording of the waiver. Typically, the waivers have a witness so that you can understand that, okay, well, this person saw that this person signed it, and they acknowledge that they understood all the risks that were associated with whatever the activity was. And so, yeah, I'm trying to give you a Cliff Notes version of what this could look like. But that was probably one of the scenarios I spoke with a colleague, and neither one of us had an answer because this is completely new. Courts have not seen anything like this. And so when the first case does show up, I'm going to be right there with Dr. Pittman, reading it and downloading it from Westlaw, wanting to know what the specifics are and whether there was a waiver in place or if there wasn't one and what those circumstances were.
Unmute, rookie mistake. I'm sure there are other questions, and please reach out or contact us if there are, but we are at the 4 o'clock hour. So I want to thank our participants again, JD Wood, Natasha, Brison, and Adam Seipp. We can all give a virtual round of applause.
Thanks,
and thank you all for tuning in and being so engaged and participating. I encourage all to follow both our department and our center on Twitter. I've been trying to capture the highlights and capture what the presenters were saying throughout. So you'll see that you are, I mentioned you in the tweets. I don't know the correct terminology, but thank you again so much to everybody. And we wish you the very best and enjoy the rest of your summer.